In the bitter cold of February 1916, along the rolling hills of northeastern France, two mighty armies faced each other across a landscape that would soon become synonymous with human suffering. What began as a calculated German strategy to bleed France dry would transform into the longest, most devastating battle in modern history. For 302 days, over 700,000 men would fall in a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. This is the story of Verdun, where the very soul of France hung in the balance, and where hell itself seemed to open upon the earth. The year 1915 had been a stalemate of blood and mud. Across the Western Front, millions of soldiers crouched in trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Machine guns ruled no man's land. Artillery pounded positions into moonscapes of craters and corpses, and every attack seemed to accomplish nothing but adding more names to the casualty lists. The war that politicians had promised would be over by Christmas 1914 had devoured an entire generation, yet neither side could claim victory. In Berlin, General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, stared at maps that told a grim story. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts, her resources stretched thin, her people growing weary of endless sacrifice. The great offensive strategies of 1914 had failed. The Schlieffen Plan lay in ruins. Something had to change, or the Central Powers would slowly be crushed by the weight of the Allied war machine. Falkenhayn was not a man given to grand gestures or romantic notions of warfare. He was a cold strategist who understood that wars were won not by capturing cities or breaking through lines, but by destroying the enemy's will to fight. His eyes settled on a name that would soon echo through history: Verdun, a fortress city that had guarded the approaches to Paris for centuries, a symbol of French pride and determination. More importantly, it was a place the French could never abandon. The German plan was diabolical in its simplicity. They would not try to capture Verdun quickly. Instead, they would force the French to defend it at any cost, then bleed them white with artillery fire and methodical attacks. As Falkenhayn coldly calculated, there were objectives within German reach for which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they had. If they did so, the forces of France would bleed to death. The city of Verdun sat in a salient, a bulge in the French lines that jutted into German-held territory. This geographic weakness made it vulnerable to attack from three sides, while a ring of 19 massive forts provided its defense. These concrete and steel behemoths, built in the 1892, had once represented the pinnacle of military engineering. Their thick walls and underground galleries seemed impregnable to the weapons of the previous century. But warfare had evolved with terrifying speed. The German army now possessed weapons that would have seemed like the instruments of gods to earlier generations. The massive 420mm siege guns, nicknamed Big Berthas, could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton over distances of more than 6 miles. These monsters had already proven their worth by reducing the Belgian forts at Liège to rubble in 1914. Even more ominous were the new tactics of artillery bombardment. German gunners had perfected techniques that could saturate entire square miles with explosive shells, creating killing zones where nothing could survive. They had learned to coordinate different types of artillery, mixing high explosive shells that destroyed fortifications with shrapnel rounds that shredded human flesh, and poison gas shells that turned the very air into a weapon. The French, however, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1915, convinced that modern artillery made fixed fortifications obsolete, the French General Staff had stripped the Verdun forts of most of their heavy guns and garrison troops. These weapons and men were desperately needed elsewhere along the front, they reasoned, and the forts themselves were judged to be death traps that could not withstand modern bombardment. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most imposing of the Verdun fortifications, stood nearly empty. This massive structure, protected by layers of concrete over a meter thick and surrounded by a 7-meter deep moat and 30 meters of barbed wire, housed barely 60 men, instead of the hundreds it was designed to shelter. The French had effectively disarmed their own strongest position just as their enemies prepared to attack it. As winter deepened in early 1916, German preparations intensified. Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's eldest son, was given command of the Fifth Army, the force designated to carry out Operation Judgment. Despite his royal title, Wilhelm was an experienced commander who understood the magnitude of the task ahead. His army assembled in the forests around Verdun like a coiled spring, ready to unleash destruction on an unprecedented scale. The German buildup was methodical and massive. More than 1,300 guns were positioned in carefully concealed positions, ranging from light field pieces to the enormous siege mortars that had crushed Belgian resistance. Ammunition dumps grew into small mountains of shells, each one destined to add to the coming symphony of destruction. Railway lines were extended to carry the tons of supplies needed to feed the artillery beast. Elite German assault troops trained in new tactics designed to exploit the chaos that would follow the bombardment. These Stoßtruppen, or shock troops, were equipped with flamethrowers, grenades, and portable machine guns. They learned to advance in small groups, bypassing strong points and penetrating deep into enemy positions before the defenders could recover from the artillery barrage. French intelligence detected signs of the German buildup, but the scale and intent remained unclear. Reports filtered back of increased enemy activity, of new gun positions being prepared, of fresh divisions moving into the sector. Yet the French High Command focused on their own planned offensives for 1916, failed to grasp the magnitude of the threat gathering before Verdun. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, remained convinced that the Germans lacked the strength for a major offensive. His attention was focused on the planned Anglo-French assault along the Somme River, scheduled for summer 1916. Verdun, in his view, was a quiet sector where worn-out divisions could rest and recover from the rigors of more active fronts. The defenders of Verdun consisted primarily of reserve divisions and territorial units, older men, and those deemed unfit for service in more critical sectors. Their positions were thinly held, their supplies limited, their morale dampened by months of inactivity and the bitter cold of an unusually harsh winter. Many of the trenches were poorly constructed, lacking the deep dugouts and sophisticated obstacles that characterized positions elsewhere along the front. As February progressed, German artillery began what appeared to be routine harassing fire against French positions. These preliminary bombardments served multiple purposes, registering targets for the coming storm, while masking the true scale of preparations. French soldiers huddled in their inadequate shelters, cursing the enemy shells but having no inkling that they were merely the prelude to an apocalypse. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the defenders. Thick snow blanketed the hills around Verdun, making movement difficult and observation nearly impossible. The cold was so severe that weapons jammed, water froze in canteens, and men suffered from frostbite even in their trenches. Supply lines, already stretched thin, became even more precarious as trucks and wagons struggled through the icy roads. On the night of February 20th, an eerie quiet settled over the Verdun sector. German batteries that had been firing intermittently fell silent. In the French trenches, soldiers welcomed the respite, unaware that their enemies were making final preparations for the most concentrated artillery bombardment in military history. Gun crews checked their weapons one last time, ammunition was stacked within easy reach, and observation posts prepared to direct the storm that would break with the dawn. The stage was set for a battle that would redefine the very meaning of warfare, where courage and cowardice, heroism and horror would be forged in the crucible of industrial-scale killing. In just a few hours, the quiet hills of Verdun would erupt in flames that would burn for 10 months, consuming armies and reshaping the destiny of nations. At 4:15 in the morning on February 21st, 1916, the world exploded. In a single, earth-shattering moment, 1,300 German guns opened fire simultaneously across an 8-mile front. The sound was beyond human comprehension, a roar that could be heard over 60 miles away in Nancy. Soldiers later described it not as noise but as a physical force that crushed the breath from their lungs and turned their bowels to water. This was not artillery fire as warfare had known it before. This was the orchestrated destruction of everything that lived and breathed in the target zone. High explosive shells weighing hundreds of pounds crashed down every few seconds, each one capable of obliterating a house or creating a crater 20 feet across. Shrapnel rounds burst overhead, filling the air with thousands of razor-sharp fragments that could slice a man in half. Gas shells hissed and leaked their poisonous contents into shell holes and trenches, turning every breath into potential death. The French positions simply vanished. Trenches that had taken months to dig were erased in minutes. Communication lines were severed, command posts buried under tons of earth and concrete. Men who had survived years of war were driven mad in the first hour by the relentless, crushing weight of the bombardment. Those who tried to flee were caught in the open and torn apart by the endless rain of steel. For 10 hours, the German guns pounded the French lines without pause. When the smoke finally began to clear, the landscape looked like the surface of an alien world. Every tree had been stripped of bark and leaves, standing like skeletal fingers against the grey sky. The ground itself had been churned and rechurned until it resembled a sea of mud mixed with metal fragments and human remains. Shell holes overlapped shell holes in an endless pattern of destruction that stretched to every horizon. At 4 in the afternoon, German infantry began their advance. These were not the massed formations of earlier wars, but small groups of highly trained assault troops moving with deadly purpose. They expected to find nothing alive in the wasteland before them, yet somehow, incredibly, French soldiers emerged from the deepest dugouts and shell holes to fight back. These men, half-deaf and shell-shocked, their uniforms torn and faces blackened by explosions, represented something that Falkenhayn had not calculated into his cold equations. The German advance was methodical and terrifying. Flamethrower teams scorched French positions that showed signs of resistance, sending jets of liquid fire 30 feet through the air. Machine gun crews set up their weapons in carefully chosen positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that cut down anyone who tried to move between the shell holes. Pioneer units with explosives cleared paths through the wire obstacles that had somehow survived the bombardment. Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of the Verdun defenses, fell on February 25th in a manner that shocked both armies. A small German patrol, comprising fewer than 20 men, had been probing the fort's perimeter when they discovered that the main entrance was unguarded. The skeleton crew inside, consisting of just 57 men commanded by a sergeant, was overwhelmed before they could even attempt to resist. The fall of Douaumont sent shockwaves through France that reached all the way to Paris. This was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological catastrophe. The fortress had been considered impregnable, a symbol of French engineering and determination. Its loss after less than a week of fighting seemed to confirm German claims that French resistance was crumbling. In the French capital, politicians and generals gathered in emergency sessions. The newspapers, despite heavy censorship, could not hide the magnitude of the disaster unfolding at Verdun. Families across France waited anxiously for news of sons, fathers, and brothers who had been stationed in what was supposed to be a quiet sector of the front. General Joffre faced the most critical decision of his career. Every military principle suggested that Verdun should be abandoned. The salient was a trap, vulnerable from 3 sides, difficult to supply and reinforce. The logical course would be to withdraw to stronger positions and let the Germans exhaust themselves in costly attacks against prepared defenses elsewhere. Yet Joffre understood that some battles transcend mere military logic. Verdun had become a symbol, and symbols cannot be abandoned without destroying the spirit of those who believe in them. To retreat from Verdun would be to admit defeat, not just in a single battle, but in the war itself. The psychological impact on French morale would be catastrophic, potentially fatal to the nation's will to continue fighting. On February 26th, Joffre made his choice. Verdun would be held at any cost. To accomplish this seemingly impossible task, he turned to a man whose reputation for defensive warfare was unmatched in the French army. General Philippe Pétain was summoned from his sector command and given direct control of the Verdun defenses with explicit orders to hold the line no matter what the cost in men or materials. Pétain arrived at his new headquarters to find chaos. Communications with the front lines had been severed by the German bombardment. Units were scattered and leaderless. The single road and railway line connecting Verdun to the rest of France were under constant artillery fire, making resupply nearly impossible. The German advance continued daily, methodically capturing key positions and closing the noose around the city. The new commander's first priority was establishing a lifeline to the outside world. The narrow road running south from Verdun to Bar-le-Duc became the focus of a massive logistical effort that would soon earn it an immortal name. This secondary highway, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, would become known as the Sacred Way, the umbilical cord that kept Verdun alive through its longest ordeal. Day and night, an endless stream of vehicles moved along the Sacred Way. Trucks carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fresh troops to the battle. The same vehicles returned loaded with wounded men whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of those who had looked into the abyss. During the peak of the crisis, 1 truck passed every 14 seconds, creating traffic jams that stretched for miles. The road itself became a casualty of war. The constant passage of heavy vehicles, combined with the impact of German shells that fell short of their intended targets, reduced the surface to a quagmire of mud and broken stone. Entire companies of soldiers were assigned to road maintenance, working around the clock to keep the lifeline open. Quarries were opened nearby to provide the crushed stone needed to repair the constantly deteriorating surface. Pétain's defensive strategy was revolutionary in its methodical precision. Instead of trying to hold every position with maximum force, he created a defense in depth that would absorb German attacks and then counterattack to retake lost ground. Artillery became the backbone of this strategy, with carefully coordinated barrages designed to break up German attacks before they could reach French positions. The general understood that Verdun would not be won or lost in a single decisive battle, but through the accumulation of countless smaller actions. Each hill, each fort, each trench line would be contested with maximum violence. The Germans might advance, but they would pay in blood for every yard of ground. If Falkenhayn wanted a battle of attrition, Pétain would give him exactly that, but on terms that would favor the Sacred Way within the defenders. French reinforcements began arriving along days of Pétain's appointment. These were not the exhausted reserve units that had initially defended Verdun, but front-line divisions pulled from other sectors of the front. They came with modern equipment, adequate ammunition, and most importantly, the determination to hold ground that had become sacred to French national identity. The battle that had begun as a calculated German strategy to bleed France white was transforming into something far more complex and deadly. Both armies were now committed to a struggle that would test the very limits of human endurance. The hills around Verdun would become a laboratory where new forms of warfare were born in an atmosphere of unimaginable violence and suffering. The transformation of Verdun from a strategic objective into a symbol of national survival changed everything. What Falkenhayn had envisioned as a controlled bleeding of French forces became a mutual destruction that neither side could escape. The German Crown Prince Wilhelm found his Fifth Army locked into a battle that defied every principle of mobile warfare his father's generation had mastered. German attacks continued with mechanical precision through March and April, but the easy victories of the opening days were gone forever. French resistance stiffened with each passing week as Pétain's reorganization took hold. The artillery duels that raged across the scarred landscape consumed ammunition at rates that staggered supply officers on both sides. German guns fired over 2 million shells in the first 6 months alone, while French batteries responded with their own hurricane of steel and explosives. The physical landscape around Verdun began to resemble something from another planet. Aerial photographs showed a moonscape of overlapping craters where forests and farms had once flourished. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages disappeared entirely, their stones and timbers scattered by repeated bombardments until nothing remained to mark where human beings had once lived and worked. Individual battles within the larger struggle took on names that would haunt survivors for decades. Dead Man's Hill, Hill 304, Fleury Village, each became the focus of attacks and counterattacks that cost thousands of lives for gains measured in yards. Fleury itself changed hands 16 times during the battle, with each occupation leaving fewer buildings standing until finally nothing remained but rubble and corpses. The horror of Verdun lay not just in the scale of casualties, but in the nature of the killing itself. Artillery bombardments could last for days without pause, driving men insane with their relentless thunder. Soldiers learned to identify different types of shells by their sound as they approached. The whistle of high explosives, the buzz of shrapnel rounds, the sinister hiss of gas shells, each carried its own particular terror. French soldiers developed a grim humor about their situation. They called Verdun the mill or the meat grinder, acknowledging that men went in but did not come out unchanged, if they came out at all. Letters home spoke of landscapes where the dead outnumbered the living, where shell holes filled with rainwater turned pink from dissolved blood and flesh. Medical services collapsed under the weight of casualties that exceeded every previous calculation. Field hospitals operated in underground chambers, their surgeons working by candlelight while shells crashed overhead. Morphine ran short, then disappeared entirely. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia, while patients bit down on leather straps to muffle their screams. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Shell shock, a condition barely recognized before the war, became epidemic among units that served extended tours at Verdun. Men who had shown courage in previous battles became cataleptic at the sound of distant gunfire. Others developed uncontrollable tremors that made it impossible to hold weapons or write letters home. German forces suffered their own special torments, as Falkenhayn's strategy trapped them in the same killing machine they had created for their enemies. Elite assault units that had spearheaded the initial attacks were ground down to nothing in repeated assaults against French positions that grew stronger each week. The Crown Prince Wilhelm, watching his divisions dissolve in the furnace of Verdun, began to question the wisdom of continuing attacks that gained little ground at enormous cost. By summer 1916, both armies had been bled nearly white, yet neither could disengage from the struggle. French national honor demanded that Verdun be held at any cost. German prestige required that the offensive succeed after such massive investments of men and material. The battle had developed its own momentum, consuming reinforcements as quickly as they could be fed into the line. The Sacred Way became more than a supply route. It became a pilgrimage route for French soldiers. Men marched north knowing they might never return, yet singing songs that spoke of duty and sacrifice. The road itself bore the scars of its service, its surface broken by constant traffic and enemy shelling, its shoulders lined with the graves of men who had died keeping it open. French artillery tactics evolved rapidly under the pressure of constant combat. Battery commanders learned to mass their fire with unprecedented precision, creating walls of steel that could stop German advances cold. Counter-battery fire became a deadly science, as observers learned to locate enemy guns by the flash of their muzzles and direct devastating responses within minutes. The introduction of new weapons added fresh dimensions of horror to an already hellish battlefield. Flamethrowers sprayed liquid fire into trenches and shell holes, turning human beings into living torches. Poison gas attacks became routine, forcing soldiers to fight while wearing masks that limited vision and breathing. Underground mining operations placed enormous charges beneath enemy positions, creating explosions that could be felt miles away. French morale, which had wavered during the initial German successes, began to strengthen as the battle dragged on without decisive German victory. Petain's promise that they shall not pass became more than a slogan. It became a sacred oath that bound together soldiers from across France. Units that had never served together before developed fierce loyalties forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The arrival of summer brought new challenges as heat combined with the stench of decomposing corpses to create conditions that tested human endurance beyond all previous limits. Water became more precious than ammunition as supply lines struggled to meet the needs of hundreds of thousands of men fighting in a wasteland where every natural source had been contaminated by chemical weapons or rotting flesh. German casualties mounted with each passing month as French defenses proved far more resilient than Falkenhayn had anticipated. The elite regiments that had begun the offensive as confident, well-trained formations were reduced to hollow shells filled with replacements who lacked the experience and motivation of the original troops. Unit cohesion, the foundation of military effectiveness, began to crumble under the grinding pressure of endless combat. By August, cracks appeared in the German High Command's confidence in the Verdun strategy. Reports from the Crown Prince Wilhelm painted an increasingly grim picture of an army trapped in a battle it could neither win nor abandon. Staff officers who had calculated French collapse within weeks now spoke of months or even years of continued fighting with no guarantee of success. The failure of repeated German assaults to break through French lines, despite enormous sacrifices, raised fundamental questions about Falkenhayn's strategy. Critics within the German army began to argue that the offensive had become exactly the kind of costly attrition battle that Germany, with its limited manpower reserves, could not afford to fight. The bloodletting at Verdun was draining German strength as rapidly as it was consuming French forces. Meanwhile, other fronts demanded attention and resources that were locked up in the Verdun offensive. The Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front had shattered Austrian forces and threatened to knock Austria-Hungary out of the war entirely. The British offensive on the Somme, launched in July, created another massive drain on German reserves. Falkenhayn found himself fighting a multi-front war with insufficient forces to achieve decisive results anywhere. The strategic initiative, which Germany had seized with the opening bombardment in February, began to slip away as summer turned to autumn. French forces, their confidence restored by months of successful defense, began planning counter-offensives designed to recapture the ground lost in the opening phase of the battle. The hunter was becoming the hunted, as the balance of power shifted imperceptibly but decisively along the shell-torn ridges around Verdun. The guns finally fell silent on December 18th, 1916, after 302 days of unimaginable carnage. When the smoke cleared and the counting began, the numbers told a story that defied comprehension. 700,000 casualties, 300,000 dead, entire divisions erased from existence. The sacred ground around Verdun had consumed the equivalent of entire cities, leaving behind a wasteland so poisoned with unexploded shells and chemical residue that it remains dangerous over a century later. Falkenhayn's strategy to bleed France white had failed catastrophically, but not before bleeding Germany just as thoroughly. Both nations had fed their finest young men into the furnace of Verdun, and both emerged forever changed by the experience. The battle that was supposed to end the war had only made it longer and more terrible, proving that industrial warfare could consume entire generations without producing decisive victory. Yet from this hell emerged something that transcended military calculations. The French had held their ground not through superior strategy or overwhelming force, but through sheer determination. They had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. The phrase "they shall not pass" became more than words. It became the embodiment of a nation's refusal to surrender its soul. Today, the fields around Verdun remain a monument to human sacrifice and endurance. The red zone, where nothing can grow and no one can safely walk, stands as testimony to the terrible cost of modern war. In that blasted landscape lies a lesson that echoes across the decades. Some battles are won not by those who advance the furthest, but by those who refuse to yield when everything seems lost.